Hi, my name is Jim Walton. I am from the Third Choice, and I am once again welcoming to the show Dr. Esther Meek. We're so glad that she could be with us today. Today, we're going to talk about knowing God and what it means to know God. She's written a book called Longing to Know. You've probably written other books too, Esther, but the one we'll be talking about today is Longing to Know because it pertains to knowing God. So, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Mm. I'm happy to be here. It's great to
Great.
see you and always to be with you.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So, if we just start right in here, I talk with people all the time on my website about spiritual things, about the Bible, about religion, and a very, very common comment that I get is that knowing God is completely different dynamic and a completely different kind of relationship than knowing people, than knowing facts, than knowing anything that we know. That knowing God is a completely different kind of, yeah, how do I say this? Because you never get to see God, you never get to hear his voice, you never get to interact with him like we do in normal relationships. Of course, the real the atheists who say, you might as well be talking to the flying spaghetti monster, you might as well be talking to the fairy in the sky, because we can't really know um, God in any sense of real knowledge. But you claim exactly the opposite, that knowing God is no different than knowing the
Mm.
mechanic who works on your car. So I'm just gonna give you a
I'm
wide
bald.
berth, Esther, to explain what it means to know God, and how is it that we know God, that it's the same dynamic.
hmm hmm
Go, it's all
Well,
yours.
first of all, please know that yeah, I wrote a book on it, which means don't expect so much of 40 minutes. Okay, I'll do the best I
Okay,
can, but
yeah, okay,
but
that's fair.
if it goes too fast, I do commend the book to you, just for the time framework of it. But I have to say that uh, my upbringing, which I think is like yours, I grew up in a Bible believing church and uh, looking to the Bible to know about God, to know God, all those kinds of things. But I found myself at, I'd say age 13, having these, what I call big, hairy questions, which I thought were sin at the time. One was, how do I know that God exists? And the other is, quite honestly, how do I know that you exist? Because it seemed to me that all that I could be certain of were the ideas in my mind. And precisely because that was what I could be certain of, my ideas were actually blocking me from reality. And I knew that sounded crazy, but as far as I could tell, I had no proof of a world outside of my mind, so let alone God.
Some would
And
even some would even say that we can't be sure of that because we may be a computer simulation and the thoughts in your
right,
mind are
exactly.
not even real.
That's that's right. And it took me some years to find out that everybody thinks that way, not just me, who has been born into the modern West. When I say modern, I mean as in Descartes, 1650, father of the modern milieu. And there were some big changes in the way we think about knowing and reality at that point that were really precipitous and I'd say disastrous. And because of that, the matrix idea, that I'm just kind of in here and that's all I'm sure of, and I can't be sure of reality beyond me. We all inherited that. So I will never run out of work to do because we all inherit that in the water, which actually is so ironic because we have to drink it with our bodies, you know. But so those were my questions. And so when it came to knowing God, I knew what I was supposed to know about God. So I thought, I know that's pretty crazy. But what I didn't know was knowing. And And you can throw reality in on that too, because and I didn't know my questions were philosophical. I thought they were sin. So I had to figure that out. I had to figure that out and then think about how knowing works. And
Yeah,
in God's kind
because asking questions is not sin. Right.
well, I couldn't imagine that Jesus would be happy with me if I wasn't sure that he was there.
Yeah.
So, that just didn't sound like a great way to start. And quite honestly, nobody at church talked about these things. So I actually, I kept them to myself. But so I can look at my whole story as one big quest for reality. And I've spent decades on it. And I started to get some beginnings of hope in my 20s with some of the philosophical work that I do. And so what longing to know is, well, there's several things that it is, but one thing it is my justifying my own Christianity to myself. Okay. And so the question of longing to know is, how do we know? And can we know God? But yes, let's first talk about how knowing works. And so then I incorporate and develop the ideas of this philosopher whose work I found and became an expert in, and use that to show how all knowing works. I love to talk about keeping your balance on a bike, things like that, and then connect it to the same thing going on in knowing God. For example, if you're going to learn to ride a bike, you have to give yourself to it.
Right. It
You've got
does
to
involve a
take
commitment.
so in that respect, knowing how to ride a bike is no different from knowing God, right? So it's not like you collect information and then you ride a bike. So there is a kind of a giving of yourself bodily in the dark, in hope, actually to an authoritative guide, in my case, my father, and launching out into the dark, okay, which is not unrational. It's the heart of rationality. And so the way that knowing has been represented to us, thanks to modernity, proves to actually not be true to who we are. If we did what that version of knowing says that we inherited in the modern West, we couldn't play football. Not that I can play football, but do you see what I'm saying? So we have to be being true to an understanding of knowing, connecting with the world, in order for us to survive and to flourish in our connectedness with the world. That's what was so weird about my question. It helps to look at our ordinary acts of knowing to see what is actually going. And you see, for example, lots of components of it that in the modern West, we have been taught to relegate to something called faith that is distinguished and divorced from something called reason. And that whole divorce is profoundly mistaken. And if you thought that way, you couldn't ride a bike or play football. So when I started looking at those ordinary things and then reconnecting it with what the Bible said about knowing God, it just seemed like knowing God was an ordinary act of knowing. Now, riding a bike doesn't change my life the way God does. But God is a special sort of being that is such that we're in him. It's kind of goofy to consider him as far off when we understand from Scripture we are our very breath is in his hands. So everything that is the yes that I am is his yes, down to my every atom and my every molecule. So in that respect, God far outclasses my auto mechanic or anything else. He's intimate to me in an incredible way, not because somehow I've stuck him inside me, but he's stuck me inside him. So it's more like
but
that.
but I get to see my mechanic. I get to talk to him. I get to look at him face to face and discuss my car. I get to see my friends and, interact with them. People say that knowing God is only a mystical experience, and what they usually mean by mystical is imaginary. It's not like science, it's not like real life, it's not like real people. It's a completely different thing, and in that sense, they say we really can't know God because it's just in your imagination.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would respectfully dispute that.
Well,
So,
talk to me.
and actually in the book, as the story goes, the auto mechanic I had in St. Louis, who a lot of my friends still use, including my children, I never did see him because another family member would take the car to the place where I worked and leave it. And then the people would come from the mechanic and pick up my car, go fix it, bring it back. So of course I didn't see him. And that actually testified to his greatness because he would do that service. So I never saw him. But what would happen is the car would change.
But other people saw him, so we know he wasn't imaginary. Like the
Sure,
unicorn, like a unicorn in the sky or the flying spaghetti monster. We know our mechanic is not imaginary. So
true.
how is knowing God the same as knowing him or her?
Well, I have reports from the people who saw him. And that's part of what the Bible is reports of his having been seen. And then the other thing I have is, I think as you think about uh, the amazing question that you exist, and you start to think about why you exist rather than don't exist, and you start to think through some of those things, some things have to be the case.
What do you mean
So,
by that? What do you mean some things have to be the case? You mean there's some things you have to assume? Is that
well,
what you mean?
I, I think that maybe the word would be conclude. So, um, I could be easily eradicated by a shotgun, right? Or something that would end my existence. When the way philosophers talk about that, and we all do actually, is to say our existence is contingent on something else, right? And you've called attention to the beautiful backdrop that's actually real behind you. But everywhere your eyes look, your eyes land on something that might not exist. But if everything did might not exist, then it's possible that it all would not be. So the question is, why are you here? Why are you here? And so there needs to be something that accounts for that. And so that, I think, automatically draws humans into wondering about what that anchor would have to be.
But we
So I
never
think it's natural to think that way.
we never get to see God like you can see the flowers and the trees in the barn behind me. We never get to talk to God like you get to talk to your daughters. You never get to hear his voice like I get to hear yours. How do we know he's there? How do we know that we can know God?
Well, a part of all of knowing involves trusting authoritative guides or authoritative words. And for example, if I were going to learn to read an x-ray, I would have to go to radiology school, and then I would have to believe what I was told until I learned to see it. And so the authoritative guides help me to see what is there. And so when your eyes are opening right now, and when you're looking at things, what you are actually seeing is the word of the Lord. And you're seeing the steadfast love of the Lord. And that's not some secret, mystical something or other. I think that's the bottom line. That's what you're seeing. But you need an authoritative guide to help you to see what is there. And we have to consent to the authoritative guide, and then we have to do what the authoritative guide says, and then we start to understand. So understanding is on down the line, from the commitment, and then the actual indwelling of the words that that are being directed, that are directing us.
All right, now
Right.
you.
So when I open my eyes, I'm seeing the word of the Lord. I'm seeing his yes, his let there be, let there be. I'm seeing it. And now I see that. But it's because I've been trained, because I've attended to the words of Scripture.
All right,
And I've thought a lot about it.
but isn't it circular reasoning to say that what we can know of God is told us in a book, but the book in itself tells us that the book is believable, and we assume the book is believable, and so that we assume that it's an authoritative um, source of knowledge for us. But isn't that just all circular? We believe it because we say we believe it because it says it's believable, and
Well,
we sort of generate our own authority based on total subjectivity.
well, first of all, I'd like to say the form that my puzzlement took when I was 13 was to say, well, what about this weird thing that Christians are supposed to believe a book to tell them about God, and find all the evidence there? That was like the very thing that bothered me. And that's why it was incredibly helpful to me to find out that every line of inquiry requires a normative dimension. It absolutely requires it. You have to be taught to see what is there, which means you've got to choose the right guide. And yes, that is incredibly risky, but it's no different with regard to knowing God than it is with regard to knowing how to fly a fighter jet, as I was told by one second career student at seminary. You cannot fly a fighter jet unless you have authoritative guides. So really the order of coming to know anything involves a first step of trusting a normative word that at the point that you trust them, you do not understand.
Right,
And
but
so then then what you have to do is you have to actually give yourself to that. So there are an array of clues that we have to somehow try to climb into. And the normative guide, the normative word, or the authoritative guide gives us text that at the time we begin, we may not even understand. Like if I were to go to calculus class and have to learn calculus, I would be in a desperate plight, and I would be clinging to the words, the inscrutable words of the professor. Somehow I would have to, in the dark, have to start by doing what he says, or she. And then, and doing that, even though I don't even understand what I'm doing, right? And it would be only when I submit to that authority and put myself inside and give myself to the calculus, or in the case of a bike, give myself to the bike, that I would only begin to start to have insight come.
right, but isn't there a difference when we're talking about riding a bike or playing football or doing calculus or flying a fighter jet? You know, we're talking about science. But when we're talking about God, we're not talking about science. Where it's metaphysical, it's mystical. You know, isn't it just a completely different thing that's not in the same category as learning to ride a bike or learning to fly a jet? Those are based on science.
Well, the philosopher whose work I became an expert in was a scientist turned philosopher. He was a premier scientist at the beginning of the 20th century. And he left science, he felt, to save science by doing philosophy about science. And what he wanted to argue, and I've been rereading his magnum opus the last few days for a project that I'm doing, and he is endeavoring to make the case that all scientific discovery relies on what he calls tacit coefficients, and those involve acts of commitment and judgments that may be mistaken they involve hazards. But if you do not make them, you cannot do science. So the scientific method as conventionally understood is not how science works. And his job was discovery. So the question is, how do you come to know what you do not yet know? And that's a launch into the unknown. And if you don't give yourself to it in the form of trust and risk and decisions and submission, the whole book is example after example of this. Science does not happen. So he would say, no, it is the same.
Now, why don't you give us his name so that if somebody wants to read his work directly, they can?
Sure. His name is Michael Polanyi, and that is spelled Polanyi. He was a Hungarian premier scientist, died in 1976, but he had a flamingly brilliant career in science before he just became really preoccupied with what makes science what it is, and in particular in challenging the really defective and prohibitive idea of knowledge as somehow an impassive, indifferent collecting of facts that involves no commitment. So I commend his work to you.
All right. Now, thank you, because people might want to read that. But in your book, Longing to Know, you make an analogy with those magic eye pictures. And if you remember the magic eye pictures from a couple decades ago, I'll just explain to anybody who's watching this. They were those pictures that when you first looked at them, they looked like nothing. They looked like just colors and geometric patterns and shapes. But if you could somehow unfocus your eyes, or they said focus your eyes as far beyond the picture as you were in front of the picture, that suddenly or gradually this image would come clear inside the picture and you could actually see. And some people actually never got it. They never actually got to see whatever those pictures were. But you make an analogy of those magic eye pictures. So how do those magic eye pictures illustrate not only knowledge in general, but knowing God in particular?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking me that. Well, if the magic eyes don't work for you, what you need to think of is learning to read. And if you can't remember learning to read, imagine what it would be like now to be learning to read Chinese. Okay,
right,
so
because you can't
are
just sound it out.
Right. So if I were learning to read Chinese, I'm all packed up right now because I'm moving. But it used to be there was a wonderful Chinese script hanging there that my family inherited that was of Matthew 11:28. I was told. I had it there because it was beautiful, not because I could read it. Right? So it would be something like that. So maybe magic eyes don't work for you, but reading is like that. And here's what happened when, for example, if I can slightly adjust the example, I taught my kids to read. And so at the time for each of them, I taught them some rules, some phonetic rules, right? And then there was a point at which I was saying, "Oh, you're being buzzed."
I'm getting buzzed by bumblebees.
That's because you're so sweet.
Go away.
Well, so that's what happens when you've got a real backdrop. But so I taught them the rules to follow. And then there was a point at which the series I was using had a bunch of little books that were, conditioned on the rules that they would have learned by that point. And for each of them, there was a point at which I handed them the first book. And they opened the book and they just started following the rules, dutifully following the rules. And then all of a sudden they went, "Oh!" And it was at that moment that they realized they were reading. And what happens at that moment, and it's the same with the "oh, I see it" moment with the magic eye, is somehow your body figures out how to make the switch from looking at to looking from to see a farther pattern. At the point that you're like at point A, when nothing's making any sense, you're looking at all these meaningless bits that don't go together, right? Or they're just pretty or something like that. But you have to give yourself to the idea that there might be a deeper meaning. So there's the trust thing. You have to give yourself to that. And then somehow you've got to struggle to make your body do what the authoritative guide is telling you to do. That's how the magic eyes work with the direct. You have to follow the directions, but you've got to figure out what the directions mean by trying them out. But what that does is engender this switch so that what you are looking at starts to become part of you. Polanyi's word was subsidiary. And then that's what opens up reality to you. So once you learn to keep your balance on a bike, the world opens up to you in possible bike paths. But before that point, you cannot make any sense of it. So that switch is what I call the OIC at moment, where you go from looking at to looking from to shape a farther pattern.
Okay.
And that happens in everything that humans do. Everything.
No different knowing God than knowing that this is a geranium next to me, right?
Correct.
It's
That's
no
right.
different. I know that's a geranium because I've been told that's a geranium. That's been identified by horticulturalists for me as a geranium, and in books it says it's a geranium, and so I call it a geranium. And we understand the nature of language, that we symbolically represent reality with language, and if we have a consensus that that's a geranium, then we say we know it.
Yeah, and I think we settle in our day by saying that is a geranium is kind of the extent of our knowledge, and that our goal in life is collecting all the information we can. And I would respectfully dispute that. I would say that there's a bigger goal that you as a human are called to do, and that is commune with reality. So your job with that geranium has only begun when you say that is a geranium. You've got your work to do. You want to get to know that thing and commune intimately with it. That means you've got to take some classes to be a master gardener. And you've got to find out what geraniums like, and you have to learn to read geraniums because they are screaming loudly to you what they like and what they don't like. But if you have not submitted to the authoritative guide, either of the horticulturalist or the geranium, if you're not listening and submitting to it, you can't have a relationship. So the end of knowing is not collecting information, even if it's Christian information. The end of knowing for every human being is communion with the real. And that's
Okay.
far richer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it does to me, Esther, but our listeners will get a chance to comment below the video. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a long quote from your book, Longing to Know, and I want you to unpack that for me a little bit. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to, sorry, I wish we could talk for 2 hours. But
well, we can do it another time.
on page 32, you start with this, and then I'll switch to something you said on page 78, but let me just give it to you. You say that we can never formulate foolproof criteria for certainty and knowing. It takes, I guess, a certain amount of assuming and necessarily then some leaps in logic and science, but we do it all the time and necessarily so. So you modulate from that to, if you and I wait for a fully reasoned proof of our mechanic's ability, we would never get our car fixed. It makes more sense to see that in taking my car to him, I am trusting to a reality with a certain internally coherent character. I am letting the conclusion shape my premises, which sounds backwards or circular. To take my car to him is a kind of commitment to the coherence of a vision of his integrity as real, good, and reliable. It may involve calling to halt my questioning, or to my quest for scientific certainty. It is a lived epistemic extending of ourselves to embrace a fresh sense of the real and rational. Knowing God is like this. You know, that's a whole lot of mouthful for people who don't relish philosophy. So, can you unpack that for me a little bit in lay terms?
Well, always the way I go to lay terms is to start talking about geraniums or whatever you want to talk about, you know. Uh, I think, though, a great example at this point would be a marriage. First of all, the marriage better not unpack before you've promised to love, honor, and obey, right? So it only comes in the context of pledge or covenant. And then you had better not forget that it's always a matter of grace and self-disclosure on the part of the other. You may not force it. What you have to do is attend to it and listen, right? And that's the case with the geranium too. So it takes a kind of attentive submission to the yet to be known to invite it to come. So I love to talk about inviting the real. And that probably, it's certainly the case if you're a teacher with students or a dog trainer with dogs, or something like that. What invites reality to come would be what I call a kind of etiquette, which involves an openness, a listening, that sort of a thing that invites it to come. So the dynamic of knowing is way better seen not as commodifiable collecting of information, which quite honestly is a power move. And that's why we have power issues in modernity, let me tell you, which we have our nose rubbed in a whole lot. But really what you want is a kind of asking that will invite reality graciously to self-disclose. And that cannot be. I make the distinction, Jim, between Zechariah and Mary. Both of them asked the same question, but I think Zechariah did it with his arms folded as oh yeah, how am I supposed to know this? Whereas Mary was as open as they come. She was just about to be impregnated by the Holy Spirit, right? So they both asked the question, how shall these things be, right? And the angel was not pleased with Zechariah and was pleased with Mary. And so it's a posture of invitation that invites even God to come, right? But you can see it certainly in marriage. And so in a relationship like marriage or a friendship or a parental relationship, it is not about collecting and being certain of information. And if you perish the thought had a spouse that thought you reduced to a list of facts about you, you ought to run the other way. Because what you've got is a confidence that is way more three-dimensional than a collection of information.
Right. So you're saying if all we have is information, that's just reductionistic. That just reduces what knowing and knowledge and reality are all about to words written on a page in a book. Not to discredit words written on a page in a book, but that really is nothing close to interacting
reality and knowing.
With reality and knowing. And that's where knowing God is the same as knowing science in that sense, because what we are doing is trying to interact with reality with open arms and with not needing a sense of certainty and not needing a world of information, but just understanding the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm. Right. And your connectedness in it. So you see, certainty would block you from riding a bike, and certainty would mean that no football play could ever happen, because certainty, as I define it in Longing to Know, is fixating on or focusing on what you need to trust yourself to and subsidiarily indwell in order for reality to come. You have got to give yourself to the bike. And that's not mystical, because you can palpably feel your balance on a bike and you work with it, right? It's not anything you could articulate, even though there's a formula for it, but somehow your body has indwelled that, whether you know the formula or not. And that's when you feel connected with the world.
Right. Now somebody could actually read a textbook and then on the basis of that go and change the air filter in their car. But what you're saying is that nobody could ever read a textbook and then get on a bike for the first time and ride. And even if they were able to do that, they would not be riding because of what they learned in the textbook. They would be riding because of something internal in their body interacting with the physics of riding a bike.
Well, I want to say this briefly. I argue that there's three sectors of clues. And so when I'm learning to ride the bike, I've got the situation, I've got my bodily feel, and I've got the authoritative guide. And at the point that I begin, none of that makes any sense to me. My body is as opaque and clumsy as possible. I don't understand my body. I don't understand the words being said. I don't understand the situation. But when you have that switch, and it's kind of like a gestalt switch, that you come to get inside those or have those inside you, including the words, then that's what connects you with reality. So there has to be this change from looking at to looking from. So I say knowledge is not mere information, knowledge is transformation. There has to be that change that connects you and roots you with your body, with the world, with the words, and with the world. And those come together and you subsidiarily indwell that, and that opens reality to you.
All right. On page 87 of your book, you say that there are some features of our world that point to the pattern of knowing God. Now, I don't know if you remember that particular paragraph, but we've been talking about geraniums and bikes and football and changing air filters and flying jet engines. So, what are some features of our world that point to the pattern of knowing God?
Well, I suggested this already. This is the one that does it for me. Is the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's kind of a question of wonder. But what? Why do I exist? And I'm not looking for a secret meaning or purpose. It's like, why are there things? There
Right.
needs to be an account of that. So, and then another thing that seems to me is everything that's a thing, from the geranium to you and the bumblebee, have a kind of here's the way it ought to be about them. So there's a what not to do with geraniums and a what to do, and what makes a good geranium and not a ho-hum geranium. How can I be a better person? So there's all this normativity all through it. And we know, like, one of the things I remember reflecting on and longing to know, don't know if it's that place, but all of us can know that our body feel when, for example, we would do something like break a promise or tell a lie, and it doesn't feel good. Right? So another, I remember a Buddhist friend saying to me, I could never tell a lie because my body wouldn't stand it. Right? So there's this body sense of rightness and wrongness. Right? So all of those things just go with the things that scripture tell me as far as reality. Actually, one of the things I've learned in the last couple of years that I just love is it's distinctively a Christian account that gives value to things. So Greek philosophy before Christianity had not figured out how to value things. And modern science has also rejected the value of things to the end of power and control. So to honor geraniums is distinctively Christian.
Hmm. Well, that'll make me think, Esther. You had talked, and maybe I can close with this because I know our time is rolling to an end. That knowledge is not particularly informational, but you think a more accurate term is transformational. So, how does the
Yeah.
knowledge of God transform us? Since we've been talking about the knowledge of God, and this is one of the things you've mentioned a couple times, how does the knowledge of God transform us?
Well, I think a fabulous Bible story is Thomas, who says, yeah, if I don't set my eyes on him and put my fingers in his wounds, I will not believe. And then Jesus walks into the room and says, Thomas, put your fingers in my wounds. Well, Thomas does not say, oh, got that right, check. What does he do? He falls on his face and says, my Lord and my God. What else would you do if God shows up? Except respond and say, here I am.
Okay, so what you're saying is we can see this was not just an informational advancement on his part, but a transformational I now see
Right.
it kind of moment.
Yep. And I am a different person. And that's what Polanyi said. That's what knowing does to you. It changes your being. And see, what we've done in modernity is we've reduced that to information, which means I have no responsibility and it doesn't affect me at all. And that's asinine. So pardon my language, but that's just ridiculous.
That's a valid synonym for stupid. No. Thanks, Esther. I appreciate the conversation. Anything that's on your mind that you want to plug in before we close here?
Well, I'm in the business of helping people be better at knowing, because I think knowing works this way in all walks of life. And so love to have conversations about knowing in anything from athletics to therapy to art to science.
Right.
So,
And so if any of you are interested, you can certainly pick up her book, Longing to Know. Esther also lectures around the country at various times and places, so you can try to catch
and
her.
there's some other books too.
And yeah, I'm sure there are. And are you on YouTube also, Esther?
Not yet, but I do have a website. And so Esther Meek will get you to it. And also Longing to Know will get you to it too.
Okay, and of course I post my interviews with you on my YouTube, so people can find you in one way or another. Thank
Yeah,
you very much, Doctor.
you
A
too.
pleasure to talk to you, and appreciate your giving me your time.
Okay, we'll talk again.
Yeah, I gotta find out how to turn